Okay, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm here with Parisa Noble. My name is Eric Kimberling. Again, if you'd like to subscribe to the show, you can find us on YouTube. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, whatever podcast platform of choice you'd like. And I'm excited to have a guest here with us here today, our first of three guests or three interviews we're going to have on today's episode. And Brian Potts is the managing partner and chief operating officer, or I'm sorry, chief client officer. He used to be the chief operating officer. Now he's the chief client officer at Third Stage Consulting. And Brian and myself actually started Third Stage Consulting together. And we actually, prior to Third Stage, worked at my previous company that I had started. We worked there for about 10 years together. So Brian's someone I know very well. We actually went to college together. We've known each other for 25 plus years. And we've been in this space working together now for probably, I'd say 12 or 15 years now. So the reason I wanted Brian on the show is not only is he a great guy and interesting to talk to, but because as we think about 2021 trends and where the transformation and digital space is headed, he's got a really good handle on what the market is demanding and where the market is heading. He's the one that typically will talk to new clients first. He's sort of the front line as new clients approach us for help with their transformations. And we'll look forward to that conversation. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and introduce Brian to the show. Brian, thanks for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
So Happy New Year.
Yes.
We were brand new year. I think a lot of us are anxious for 2020 to be over and looking forward to a new year. And since you're, as our chief client officer, one of your roles at Third Stage is to interact with a lot of different potential clients, and you're sort of on the front end of talking to clients even before they become clients and learning what their challenges are and what kind of things they're going through. So I want to talk to you a bit today about what you're seeing in the industry, what kind of trends you see emerging, how you think things will be different in 2021. But before we get into that, if you were to look back at 2020, what are some of the lessons, even though we all want to forget it and move on, but what are some of those lessons from 2020 that we can take with us going into the new year here?
Yeah, I think from a digital perspective, the biggest lesson learned is flexibility and willingness to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. And I think that's going to be relevant ongoing. Hopefully we don't have another COVID coming around, although there's rumors of that. But I think what we're learning from a business perspective and surrounding technology is that the ability to change to quick changing environments is extremely valuable. And technology allows you to do that. Those that were prepared, for example, for e-commerce heading into 2021, were in a far better position come, March, April last year. So I think that's, probably my biggest observation is, leave some room for flexibility, changing market conditions. And with the availability of technology that's coming, it allows us to quickly adapt to and, keep market advantage and change direction quickly.
And it's interesting how, when the pandemic first started in early 2020, it seemed like the magnitude of change would be sort of focused on remote workforces and dealing with that sort of flexibility of how do you manage a workforce in the pandemic. And that certainly is a point of flexibility that's important. But even just general business models and supply chains and how companies operate in general seems like it's been pretty significantly impacted in a number of different industries. Would you agree with that? Or are you seeing anything different?
No, that's spot on. It changed. You're right. It changed business model. You look at hospitality, restaurants, the way they do business is completely different. Several of them have unfortunately gone out of business, but there's a whole lot that are doing very well right now because of their ability to adopt and change.
Yeah. And even companies that you don't think of as like a retailer or a B2C or business to consumer type of business, even those types of businesses like B2B and industrial type of companies are forced to change in a lot of ways they might not have imagined, like providing more e-commerce type of capabilities or just interacting with their customers differently. So I think it's really interesting and probably something that could be a good thing for longer term, having that flexibility that you talked about.
Yeah, and the surrounding aspects of what the supply chain disruption and work from home and everything culminating has caused just trails of changes in almost every industry.
Right. Yeah, very true. So, as we look forward to 2021, then, what are some of the broader trends that you think organizations should be aware of as they plan out their digital or business transformations in the new year?
I think we just hit on a number of them, starting with the concept of e-commerce, those that are not currently utilizing the ability to sell products and services over the internet, finding ways to remotely deliver their products are going to continue to struggle. But what comes beyond that is it opens up new markets. So once you start looking at e-commerce, how do you it changes the dynamics of buy-sell relationships. So, things like marketing automation. I think we're going to see a boost in um, those systems and technologies that will allow you to reach out, and that could be a combination of artificial intelligence with mixed with e-commerce and market automation to reach new clients, get people to recognize who you are. Because all of a sudden, if you are a retail store and you're not you shut down your brick and mortar operations, you've got the ability to sell it anywhere, and you need to do that. You need to open up new markets. So I think finding ways to do that is where people are going to be utilizing a lot of technology. The other thing you mentioned coming on is remote workforce. We are starting to see people going back into the offices, but we're also finding a lot of companies that found some cost savings in having remote workforce efficiencies, ease of human resources, and letting people work from home. So continuing to build, I think, not just the technologies and the remote connections, but look at security. I think we're going to see a boom in the need for data security. There's going to be increased breaches. I'll call it now. With everybody working from home, it opens up new pockets of opportunity for data hacks everywhere. So we're going to see a probably continued increase there.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great point. And in a different segment in the show, we'll have one of our team members here to talk about the SolarWinds breach and some of the risks of cloud computing and technology in general. But you hit on a few really good points there around e-commerce and remote workforces and how to deal with that. And we haven't talked a lot about it, but supply chains. I think at first people were focused more on the supply chain simply because it was so disrupted during the pandemic. And it gets back to that point of flexibility that you made. A lot of organizations are finding that their supply chains need to be more flexible in addition to, the way they interact with their customers and the way they manage their teams as well.
Yeah, well, and on the supply chain front too, you got to look at the customer service end and how frustrated are people when they didn't get their Christmas gifts in time or their holiday gifts. We need companies that are delivering especially to consumers but also to businesses need to have excellent forecasting and the ability to draw assumptions and data in with their supply chain disruptions. So if all of a sudden that a raw material is going to be delayed, you need to be able to quickly get that into your production schedule and know when your output's going to be impacted. Because if you've got suppliers depending on your products, you're not going to get out on time. They're not going to get to their consumers. You're starting a whole trend of disruption and really ultimately frustrated consumers.
And it seems like a lot of organizations were already struggling with that even before the pandemic, but they were kind of holding it together with spreadsheets and manual processes. But then the pandemic hit and it just kind of exposed some of those inefficiencies and weaknesses. And it seems like that's why a lot of companies now are actually accelerating their transformations and trying to figure out how can we avoid that sort of thing again in the future, whether it's because of a pandemic or macroeconomic trend or something else that we can't predict.
Yeah, I mean, look at what happened to steel prices recently, or lumber going through the roof, and as well as disrupted supply chains. So now you've not only got to monitor your forecasting and delivery and production schedule, but now you've got to look at your pricing models. You've got to be able to quickly vary that, because if you lock in an order on an increase in commodity and you don't have technology to help support that, you could be in a bit of trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. We were talking a bit about remote workforce, as you talked about that being one of the points of flexibility that organizations need to be thinking about, and one of the trends that has emerged here in 2020 leading into 2021. But one of the things that comes to mind as we think about remote workforces is the impact to people and just the amount of change and potential change fatigue that organizations and team members are feeling. How do you see that affecting, or do you see that affecting transformations here in the coming year?
Yeah, that's a great question, because if you look at us as humans, we don't necessarily differentiate one change for another. The more things change, we take that all in as the concept of things are changing, things are disrupting in my life. So what we've gone through in the last year will absolutely have effect. It could be either positive or negative, depending on how we react to it. I think on the positive end, people are used to change. So they're more willing and able to adopt. Those that have were all of a sudden one day sent home and said, "You're working from home. Here's a laptop. Get it set up." They've gone through a degree of change, so they're able to do it. On the other end, you've got people who are just so sick and tired of change that they don't want it anymore. We've all got those friends and neighbors who have just balled up and are pretty much ignoring coronavirus. It doesn't exist, not because they don't believe it, but because they just don't want to deal with it. And we risk that mentality coming into digital transformations. People say, "No, I've had enough change. We've already gone through this. I'm not going to make any changes with my technology." So that's going to be I think, a significant change management dynamic that we have to work through in the coming years.
Yeah, that's a good point. And what's interesting too is that while we have seen some transformations that have shifted to this remote workforce, and in many cases, the whole team for a transformation has been managed remotely, we've seen some end result of that. We've seen some companies actually go live. Some of our clients have actually gone live during this time. But we haven't seen really the big wave of companies that have fully committed to this remote workforce because they've had to, and at the same time, they've continued with their transformation. So I'd be curious to see how that affects the end result or the success or failure rate of transformations. But I think it's something to be super mindful of as companies go into transformation, is just recognizing that people are already so impacted by change, even without you doing anything new with a more formal transformation. So it's something to be aware of. So if we shift gears a little bit away from people and talk about technologies, what are some of the more common technologies or trends that you're seeing from more of a technical side for businesses and organizations as we enter 2021?
Yeah, so following up on the kind of the coming trends that we talked about, I think e-commerce is already, we've seen a boost. I think that's going to continue. We are surprisingly seeing, initially, call it over the summer, we didn't think we were going to be seeing the number of overall enterprise suite ERP type implementations, but we actually are seeing that because there's so much change. I think it's driven by there's so much change to business that people are seeing, rather than try and find these quick hit fixes that tend to build up and cause confusion. There's certainly a few of those that will continue to be needed. I think companies are finally coming to the realization that it's time to just swap out, if they've got legacy ERP and technology, that it might be time to replace that. And I think they've gotten into a flow of the current environment, remote workforce, whatever the case may be, where they're able to adopt that. So I think we're going to actually see more companies adopt to ERP. And the other reason for that is just a driving market need. Because technology is becoming available to everybody. For the last 2-3 years, small, mid-sized businesses that weren't able to even look at ERP historically now can implement systems that are built for small business. So we're finding a competitive drive to stay competitive in business. Companies are needing to adopt, those that aren't on ERP are having to adopt it, regardless of COVID or whatever else is going on. So I think that's going to be a continued trend. And then the other interesting point is all these advanced technologies, and this is we talked about some of the market automation. You talk about some of the advanced forecasting, business intelligence, the ability to use and utilize data is going to continue to grow. So interactions with artificial intelligence, robotics, we're seeing it's become more mainstream now. 2 years ago when we talked about this, it was like sort of on the leading edge. It's really not anymore. If you're in an industry where your competitors are, having machines talk to each other and share data, if you're unless you've got a very niche product, you need to start looking at that to stay competitive.
Yeah, yeah, very true. Are you seeing any differences in trends or major differences between companies that are of different sizes or in different industry verticals? So in other words, when you look at these macro technology trends, is there, any differences you're seeing among different types of organizations?
Well, we've still got so you look at the essential businesses, those that were greatly impacted, and we're still seeing some differences there. Most of those early last year took on quick hit, low hanging fruit, some core technologies that would help them transfer, remote workforces where needed, increase their production capacity, build out, we saw some people busting down walls to build out warehouses so you could have social distancing. Now those companies are needing to get, call it, more enterprise level technology to bring all those little pieces together. So they might have, brought in a new HCM to handle some remote workforce. They might have modified their supply chain and forecasting modules, and they've got a bunch of different pieces that aren't necessarily communicating or working effectively. It's now time to bring that all together, because what we saw is a lot of companies didn't take the time to strip down and define a digital strategy before they just started buying technology and fixing these quick hit needs, which they had to do. But now it's time to bring efficiency into that. Make sure everything's talking to each other. Look at where data is being stored and communicated, because I think we're going to start to see some disruption from those, call it, those rapid purchases and implementations.
Yeah, it's a great point. On one hand, it's somewhat refreshing to see organizations that are acting with a renewed sense of urgency and they aren't stalling. And we saw it, probably starting around summertime, where it seemed like clients we were working with were really operating with that heightened sense of urgency, and they had more motivation to get moving on these transformations. But there's a risk I think you're identifying there, which is you don't want to just jump in head first without having a clear plan or vision and taking that time to prepare and mobilize and all that good stuff that's important to success. So when you look at organizations that are going through some sort of transformation in 2021, what would you say are the top three keys to success that you'd recommend for an organization going through that sort of change in the new year?
Yeah, so the first one we just talked about is creating a digital strategy. Don't start adopting technology unless you've got a roadmap built out. And the reason for that is there's so much available. You look 10, 15 years back, um, and you knew you needed technology. It was pretty straightforward on what was available in the market. You kind of knew it's a matter of, let's get an ERP, either we're ready for it or we're not. Anymore, you get, that's just one small option of what you can do. You could look at changing out your HCM system. You could look at CRM. You could look at any aspect of, call it, your enterprise suite of applications and that architecture. You need to have an outline for what that looks like, so that when you purchase something and implement it, it fits into the bigger picture. Otherwise, what we we're just talking about is you're going to have a bunch of pieces, and this was occurring far before 2020, is companies were just buying all this new stuff because it looked cool and it worked for an individual or organization or functional area. But when you compile it together under the enterprise umbrella, they don't fit together. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, as you do that, make sure that you've got alignment across, especially the executive leadership of the organization, because what's happening is we're risking with this, quick change, and everybody's moving forwards. We're risking some siloing of operations. Sales will run off on their own and do this, and human resource will run off their own and do this, and operations will run off and do their own thing. And we need to make sure that the leaders of the organization are talking, that they're in alignment on, and that should be focused, like you always talk about, business strategy aligning with digital strategy. So we need to make sure that it comes from a business perspective, that you know where the business is going as an organization and strategic drive, and then fit technology to that, rather than just going out and buying technology and hope it works. So that level of alignment and called executive support would be the second thing. And I think the third is to keep that an edge of flexibility, and that goes from the ability, the willingness to change that plan. So once you set a digital strategy, that's a starting plan. It's not set in stone. You have to be able to adapt to changing conditions, like we saw in 2020. We don't think and hope they won't be as dramatic, but with the availability of new technologies, with the changing market conditions, you need to have willingness to change your strategy and also the associated budget. And that's a big one. Is if you get board approval and sign off on X number of dollars, make sure that X number of dollars includes some buffer, some contingency to make changes to that digital strategy. Because if you have to go back through that whole approval process again, you're going to be behind the times when it finally gets approved and you look to implement.
Yeah, those are great points. And I think, in this environment we're in where companies are in some ways in more of a command and control mode just because they're reacting with that sense of urgency, it gets easy to forget about your strategy or how well aligned you are. It's certainly addressing flexibility is important too. So those are really good takeaways. And I notice you haven't talked about none of those three things you recommended were specific to technology. It's really about broader issues than the technology itself, which is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's not nothing new that you need to select the right technology. That hasn't changed since the day technology was invented. But for the coming year, it's more around the business and how you adopt to that technology.
It's well put, and that's a good place to leave it for companies that are planning their strategies for the new year. We're about out of time. I want to thank you for your time, Brian. Thanks for your feedback. This has been really helpful.
Thanks for having me, and Happy New Year.
Yep, Happy New Year. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll chat with you soon.
Great. Thank you.